What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G and the OnePlus Nord N20 5G. Now, as always, before we go any further, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G, we're getting a 6.6-inch 120Hz PLS LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 400, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and an 82.5% screen-to-body ratio. With the OnePlus Nord N20 5G, we're getting a 6.43-inch AMOLED display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 409, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and an 85.3% screen-to-body ratio. So both of these phones have really good displays, but they do have slightly different advantages. On one hand, at 6.6 inches, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G is a little bit larger, and this tends to be a good thing when you're consuming a lot of content. And in addition to this, with a 120Hz refresh rate versus the standard 60Hz display, the movement on the screen with the A23 5G is going to be a little bit faster and smoother. So if you're doing something like watching videos or playing games with a lot of motion on the screen, you're going to get a smoother, more fluid experience. And in addition to this, when you're just using the phone in general, it's going to feel a tiny bit more premium. But with the OnePlus Nord N20 5G, despite the display being a little bit smaller and just having a regular 60Hz refresh rate, having an AMOLED display is a huge advantage. The colors are going to look a little bit better, the brightness is going to be better as well, and the viewing angles are also going to be better. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, the OnePlus Nord N20 5G is going to be a lot easier to see than the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G. So overall, it really comes down to personal preference. For me, I would choose the one with the AMOLED display, just because in my experience, AMOLED displays overall do end up looking quite a bit better. But that being said, with the A23 5G, again, this display is a little bit larger and it has a higher refresh rate, and both phones have really nice sharp images. So in general, if you're consuming a lot of content, despite these few differences, you're really not going to go wrong with either phone. Now for storage, the A23 5G is getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and the OnePlus Nord N20 5G is getting 128GB with microSD card expansion as well. Now keep in mind, the international variant of the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G does have 128GB as well, but any version of this phone you get in the US through a carrier is only going to have 64. So that being said, for the purpose of this comparison, the OnePlus Nord N20 5G does have a huge advantage here, having double the storage of the A23 5G, and while 64GB for the average user is at least going to be acceptable, I do think in this day and age, with stuff like apps, the system, and just files in general taking up more and more space, I do think having 128GB is a lot more ideal. But that being said, if you're more of a light user and you're not really doing a whole lot with your phone, the A23 5G with 64GB should be perfectly fine. And again, both of these phones also have microSD card expansion, and this is great if you want to offload stuff like photos and videos. For security features, both of these phones have Face Unlock, and they both have fingerprint scanners as well. With A23 5G, it's right here on the power key, and with the OnePlus Nord N20 5G, it's right here in the display. But starting with the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G, let's give these fingerprint scanners a try and see how well they work. There we go, one more time. And there we go. And now for the OnePlus. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners were real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And again, both of these phones do have Face Unlock too, so if you ever want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setups here, with the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G, we got a water drop notch for the front-facing camera. This camera is 8 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a full quad camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. With the OnePlus Nord N20 5G, we got a hole punch design for the front facing camera. This camera is 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 64 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. For video, both of these phones have a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so unfortunately no 4K here, but for phones in this price range, that is really to be expected. Now as far as photo quality goes, I feel like these phones are just about equal. The photo quality for both phones, while not being nearly as good as something like a $1,400 flagship phone for example, is still really good. So if you're taking a lot of photos for something like social media for example, and you want to get really nice photos, but you don't necessarily need the top of the line quality, in that case you're really not going to go wrong with either phone. But that being said, I do think the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G does have an advantage overall because this phone has both an ultra-wide camera and a macro camera, whereas with the OnePlus, while also having a macro camera, this phone unfortunately doesn't have an ultra-wide camera. And in my opinion, an ultra-wide camera is such a useful feature that in this price range, I feel like every phone should have it. Most phones around the price of these phones actually do. So considering that, the OnePlus Nord N20 5G not having an ultra-wide camera is definitely a bit of a drawback. So because of this, if you are taking a lot of photos and you want a wider variety of features, I would say the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G will be a better choice. But if you're just taking a few regular photos here and there and you don't really care about the ultra-wide camera, again, you're really not going to go wrong with either phone. Now, as far as RAM and processor go, these phones actually have the same processor with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 695 5G processor. And for RAM, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G is getting 4GB of RAM and the OnePlus Nord N20 5G is getting 6GB of RAM. But keep in mind, the international version of the A23 5G does have 6GB of RAM instead. But again, this specific phone in this video, as well as any version of this phone you get through a carrier in the US, does only have 4GB of RAM. But that being said, it doesn't really make a whole lot of a difference. In general, with these phones, the performance is really around the same. I feel like with mid-range phones like these, once you reach a certain level, while some phones may be a little bit faster on paper than others, they all tend to be pretty much the same. So between not only these two, but pretty much most phones in this price range, you're not going to see a significant performance difference unless you really start to get into flagship level. But that being said, I did run Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both of these phones. In here, the scores right here. Again, as you can see, it's pretty much going to be around the same level. And from my experience, I would say both of these phones are definitely really fast for what they are. No matter what you're doing on them, whether you're doing more basic activities like web browsing, social media, stuff like that, or you're doing more complex stuff like mobile gaming, whatever the case may be, unless you're really heavily using your device and you're going to be on your phone all the time, you will get a really good experience with these phones. Even if you are more of a heavy user, keep in mind these phones, while not being nearly as fast as something like an iPhone for example, are still pretty fast devices, and for the average user, both of them are going to have plenty of processing power. So no matter what, unless you're really looking for high-end performance, as far as processing power goes, you're really not going to go wrong with either of these phones. Now, as far as the battery goes, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G has a 5000 mAh battery that supports 25W fast charging, and the OnePlus Nord N20 5G has a 4500 mAh battery that supports 33W fast charging. So in general, although the OnePlus Nord N20 5G does have a slight edge in fast charging, I do think the larger battery in the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G definitely outweighs this. Sure, the OnePlus Nord N20 5G does have pretty good battery life as well, but a 5000 mAh battery is pretty much the largest battery you can get in a smartphone, at least in the US. So if you're really looking for a phone with great battery life, while again the OnePlus Nord N20 5G is not going to be a bad choice, you will be a little bit better off with the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G. And keep in mind, neither of these phones have wireless charging, which honestly is really not surprising, since after all, at this point in 2022, not very many phones that aren't flagship phones have that feature anyway. Now, as far as the software goes, this is where the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G will have a bit of an advantage. As of right now, this phone does currently have Android 12, and seeing that Samsung Galaxy A series phones are going to be getting at least 5 years of software support, you can expect to get several major updates with this phone. On the other hand, for whatever reason, the OnePlus Nord N20 5G only has Android 11, despite being a relatively new phone. So if having the latest version of Android is important to you, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G will be a significantly better choice. But that being said, if you don't care, keep in mind, Android 11 still obviously isn't a bad software in and of itself, and it is pretty well optimized on the OnePlus. Another thing to keep in mind here is that both phones do have NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using Tap and Pay, you'll be happy to know you can do that with either phone. But in conclusion, which of these devices is better? In general, this is actually really close, but each phone does have slightly different advantages. On one hand, with the A23 5G, I do think this phone has a better camera setup, because while the photo quality again is pretty similar, having an ultra-wide camera, especially in this price range, is definitely a big advantage. In addition to this, with a 5000 mAh battery versus 4500, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G is going to get much better battery life. And with Android 12, along with at least 5 years of software support, again, if you like having the latest version of Android, the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G will be a much better choice, since the OnePlus Nord N20 5G unfortunately only has Android 11, and I'm not sure when the next update is going to happen. But that being said, on the other hand, the main advantage the OnePlus Nord N20 5G has is that with 128GB of internal storage versus only 64, it has double the space. So if you're more of a power user, if you have a lot of apps and stuff like that, this is definitely going to make a huge difference for you. And in addition to this, with the AMOLED display, I do think the image looks quite a bit better, especially when you're doing stuff like consuming content, watching videos, playing games, looking at photos, pretty much everything. An AMOLED display is just gonna look a lot better, and if you're outside in the sun or just in a really bright area in general, the OnePlus will be quite a bit easier to see. But overall, despite their differences, both phones are really great devices that provide quite a bit of value for the money, and if you're looking for a solid mid-range 5G phone with a good display, great features, and really good performance, you really won't go wrong with either of them. But this concludes my comparison between the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G and the OnePlus Nord N20 5G. Again, if you want to learn more about either phone individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Cleepus Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.